back when I first started, for example, um, the login to the very old website, the blue one, if you remember that one, which if you want to look at it, it's still in this archive area. This guy, um, the back end to this one was users and passwords that were local to the database for this old site. So over time, like I guess the first real, movement in that direction of single sign-on was us starting to switch things to using LDAP, for example. So instead, now with systems like Mockform or whatever, you'd be able to come in here and you'd be able to log in with your credentials and not have to come up with a new password, right? And so that was kind of like going from, the extreme of having separate accounts for every system to starting to use our AD credentials for more things. And so for myself, for a while, I was kind of like not 100% sure whether or not we needed SSO, right? But obviously now I've kind of fully come around to the idea and it's great. But at the time, the extra complexity of it was just, it seemed overwhelming, right? Because, and I'm sure Jeff probably felt a little bit like that too at the time, because Banner 9 or XE, was barely, kind of making its way onto campuses, and SSO was a big thing with them too. So we kind of were being hit from two different directions. So like the state was pushing that shibboleth part, but they really weren't talking about protocols. And then on the Illusion side, they were talking about their identity product, but not really saying, oh, but in actuality, you can use like any single sign-on solution, really. You're not really forced into using their product. So that's why I kind of have this section highlighted, which is we had to learn the difference between the products and the protocols. So the protocols are really what's important. And it just depends on which product you're using as to which protocols it actually supports. So for example, like Shibboleth was very heavily like a SAML kind of piece of software. Apparently it also does CAS, but I don't know if that came later or whatever. But at the time, we didn't even know. So the state wasn't really giving us a ton of info and education on the topic. So when I wrote this document, it was kind of like what I knew basically at the time. And then we had them come on campus and they helped us implement the Illusion identity product, which helped us understand a little bit more. But it really wasn't like an easy piece of software to work with and manage either. And again, it was just, we were like, I was wondering, okay, how much complexity do we really want to take on with these systems? And that actually ended up eventually leading me to experiment with creating this like on-campus CAS server, which we did use for a while with Banner. And I'm still surprised that it worked as well as it did because, yeah, I guess I'm just surprised sometimes. But this one, since I built it and it was relatively simple, it really just supported the CAS protocol. And the reason why I liked CAS so much at first, especially, was because it was way simpler to at least wrap my head around compared to SAML. So you have those three different protocols, right? We have CAS, which started out in higher ed. I can't remember if it was Yale that first kind of, created it. And it pretty much returns a pretty simple XML response with, let's say, the username being passed back in the early versions. But additionally, you could pass back other things like an email address and first name and last name. SAML is kind of like that, but on steroids. So like it has a lot of extra XML stuff baked into it. And that's what's scary about it. And then the newer single sign-on stuff is kind of, this Google, Facebook, and all this other single sign-on stuff you see more today when you're logging into websites and they have like the option to log in with Google or log in with Facebook or log in with Instagram or whatever. Those typically use some flavor of OAuth 2. And then the state would throw out that word about federation, which was kind of like a bigger thing as well, which is, it's literally a federation of multiple single sign-on systems. But if I scroll down here, and hopefully you can see this okay. If not, I can make this a little bit bigger, but let's say here, I'm using Canvas as an example here. I just wanted to pull up something. Let's see, refresh. Okay. There was an option that was here on the right side, but maybe I'm not logged in anymore. Okay. I kind of lost my place there, but let me switch back over here. So when I needed to set up CAS for with Canvas, this is pretty much all I needed to do. I just needed to add in this URL and Canvas was ready to go, because this CAS server was already set to enable access from our imperial.instructure.com site. So those are already tied in. But to complete the process on the Canvas side, it was just this one URL needed to be provided. In comparison, for SAML, you usually end up needing a lot more information. In particular is like the entity ID. And in this case, we're not using PortalGuard directly. We're using the state's configuration. So it looks even more foreign. But then there's the logon URL, the logout URL. If you really want to be strict about like the certificate, this is the fingerprint of the certificate that they're using. There's the attribute that's being used for the login.
Hey, Omar, can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so this imperial.structure.com,
mm-hmm.
This is a service that we have access to, or is that okay?
It's Canvas. So, but the company, yeah. Instructure is just the actual company name. So
got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Canvas.com was probably taken when they created the company, so that's probably why they don't use that domain. But
okay.
But mainly what I'm just trying to highlight here is that Canvas, simple, SAML, scary. And that's kind of why a lot of our initial single sign-on kind of experimentation tended to focus more on CAS, right? And going back to that situation with the state and then later on us working with SIG and the Illusion product, kind of as the pieces started to fill in, I guess, some of those concepts and all that. Basically, what I started to realize is that we weren't required to use Shibboleth, for example, with the state stuff. And for the banner stuff, we weren't required to use the Illusion identity product. So really, it ended up turning into a question of, well, what's the best product out there for this? And that's a little bit of how PortalGuard kind of started to enter into that mix for us, because I think some folks at the state level had talked about it, with praise. And I think I heard that, the state had also gotten a contract to kind of work out some standardized pricing, which was another positive sign. And then I had talked with some folks at Southwestern College, and they kind of walked me through it a little bit. And I was like, oh, well, this seems a little bit more straightforward than the identity product. And the shibboleth one was even more scary because it was pretty much just all XML files. And, um, you kind of really had to know your way around all that stuff. So PortalGuard was very friendly from that kind of setup perspective, it seemed. And then on top of that, with the other options, I didn't really feel like we had a good support um, pathway. So what was nice about PortalGuard is that, they had people on the other end that if you really had a question about certain things, or if you needed assistance on setting something like a new provider or service up, that you kind of had that extra layer of support, which was nice. So that's probably the main set of reasons. And then on top of that, PortalGuard also supported all those different protocols, right? So it could, and I'm switching between here. It supported SAML 2.0. It supported CAS, and then it even had support for OAuth too, and the OpenID Connect standard, and so that kind of is a little bit future proofing in a way. So it kind of covered all of our bases on the single sign-on side, and then on top of that, because like with the Illusion Identity product, I don't think it had like a self-service password reset option. And then also like multi-factor, like if we wanted to enable, even the SMS texting option or the newer mobile authenticator apps or Duo, like I don't know if like Shibboleth would have allowed for that option, or if I'm pretty sure the Illusion Identity one does in some way, but those were other components of PortalGuard that were nice, that were going to be all together in like one solution. So that's what really kind of led us to adopting PortalGuard a couple years ago. So that's kind of the big picture kind of overview on the single sign-on side. I could definitely go into a couple more questions that maybe have come to mind, and then if you guys want me to just show PortalGuard on the back end, I can move over to doing some of that next.
I do have a question, Omar. Do we still have some applications utilizing CAS, or have we successfully moved everything over to SAML?
Well, pretty much. Well, so we do have things using CAS, yes, for sure. Like
Okay.
still, almost all of the Banner 9 stuff is still using CAS. For a second there, yeah, and Argos too. I think part of what made me pause there for a moment was just that I was thinking you were referring to this one, the old CAS server, but aside from the Campus Logic one, which we moved over in December, the only one still using the old CAS option is just Spall. And since that's going to go away pretty soon, that should allow us to get rid of this old option. And then everything's going to be on PortalGuard. Everything already is on PortalGuard except for that, basically.
Awesome. Do we have I know it's a side conversation with Spool. Do we have that sunset date already planned? Or
I think they paid for an extra year.
Okay, just for the
So
historical.
yeah, so probably I think, June 30th, if they're strict about it. And maybe sooner. I think I had asked IR, just, let me know, and then I could decommission the site.
Okay.
So, yeah, so any more, I guess, questions about the history, or did that kind of help paint a decent picture of kind of like how things came to be?
So is the Federation still out there and that's being used, right? Or do you
I
know?
think I think Captain Kirk's still out there somewhere, but
Or has the state kind of abandoned it,
as far as I know, we're still a part of it because of that setup we have with the CCC proxy. Because as a part of that, they did add our metadata into that federation. So I think we're still part of it.
Oh, okay.
There is a different layer to that, if you recall, where they were kind of promoting, oh, you guys can get free SSL certificates if you're part of In Common or something like that, But I think that was like a completely different set of steps, and we never really bothered with that. So,
Okay.
but with the state one, I believe we're still a part of it because I think the CCC proxy probably wouldn't work otherwise.
Got it. All right. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I could switch over for a little bit unless, anything ends up coming up again and I could switch back to these documents. But let me see if I can get PortalGuard open here on the screen. So one of the documents I shared with Jeff, and I guess I do have to switch back here already, is this one. This is the new service provider setup instructions. So this kind of walks through, connecting to that PortalGuard server and the backend steps that are required when we add in something new. I kind of also provide a little bit of an overview of these different areas, but I'll switch back to the server for that. So PortalGuard kind of has two programs. There's this configuration editor here on the left-hand side, and then there's the identity provider configuration editor here on the right side. A big kind of vocabulary term for PortalGuard, for single sign-on in general, and SAML kind of specifically because they use these terms more, is there's the term service provider, which is the service that you're connecting with, like a third-party solution of some sort usually. And then the piece that is PortalGuard itself here on this server is the identity provider. And so you could think of the identity provider as that source of the identity, right? Like it's where these external systems are interacting with IVC, and we have access to the Active Directory side, the banner side, and we could pull in like that user information that's needed that we pass back into the third-party systems. So does that more or less make sense?
Yes, but let me ask you something, Omar. When I'm not sure if this is related with sometimes the student, when the student, they try to log in into the WebStar portal and they are not allowed, and you usually help them and do something with them in order to, I'm not sure if this is related to those kind of little trickies that you put your magic on it.
Do you have a little bit more detail as to like one of those scenarios?
Well, I usually saw several tickets from the admission saying, hey, this student is not allowed to use the WebStar, or he's not allowed to use the portal, the student portal. And sometimes we check through the, the settings, or in his, active student and everything, it's active. And he's able, in terms of banner data, he is active and he's supposed to be able to log in. But I'm not sure why sometimes, and I don't recall really, but usually when we started with the PortalGuard, we used to have those kind of, actually students that get into the IT to ask you about those kind of issues. But I'm not sure if you recall what was the issue, because I just recall that they were not able to log in into the portal.
Yeah. So I know we have a couple different situations that crop up there. It seems like recently it hasn't been that bad since we made the switch to using single sign-on. I'm sure it's been a little bit worse for A&R because I know it causes a little bit more headaches on their end, I feel now. But so the one example that I'm thinking of the most that would happen with WebStar that was more related to something behind the scenes that I never really knew what the source was that the times when students used to log in directly into WebStar and they would get like that white screen with the error saying like to contact like ANR or whatever. That one I always felt was related to like a hold or data kind of issue that needed to be updated. But the other one that happens that's more PortalGuard related, and I can kind of detail that a little bit here, is related to information that gets synced into the PortalGuard database from Banner. So here under this user repositories area, it shows the 3 different systems essentially that PortalGuard is tied into. So we have the staff AD, the student AD, but we also have Banner, right? And I don't think it's shown directly in here. A little bit of this is used. If you guys have noticed that, I think we have it still on the WebStar login page noted. But the G number info is also part of the student's security policy. So here under password sync, we have this required repositories association, right? So this one, the students one is associated with the WebStar side. And then on the staff one, I think it's associated with both the students and the WebStar side. And the problem that this can cause is that since it's required, if PortalGuard doesn't have that association already present in its database, when somebody logs in with their student username, after logging in successfully, it's going to present them, hey, your secondary account, which is the G number one, we don't have a record for that yet. And technically, you could enter in that information manually, but people can't really do that because they would also need to know this little prefix value, which is not that little, right? I mean, it's not something that somebody's going to memorize. But if I remember correctly, I created it this way, possibly just to make it personally difficult to use that approach. And I guess the reason why is because you can use this on the login page as well. You could type in this prefix, type in your G number after it, and then type in your WebStar password and technically log in as an alternative way of getting in. But it's not something we want to promote, right? We want people to log in with their regular usernames and passwords. So that's the main one that's come up in recent memory, that students will get that prompt. And the reason why they get that prompt is because they're so new that the PowerShell script server hasn't had an opportunity to run this process yet, which is where the linked account kind of associations get made. So every hour, it looks like, I used to have it on 2 hours, but it looks like every hour now I have that being run to try and get that into the PortalGuard database from Banner more quickly, to kind of minimize those issues.
So for Betsy's knowledge, and I guess for everybody, that there's a syncing process that takes place when a student comes in, and sometimes I guess they go ahead of that syncing process.
Yeah, and I would say like probably most often the situation where that would crop up is like, let's say the student literally just applied that morning, with ANR, let's say, or whatever. And maybe it's made its way all the way into Banner, but from there it still needs a little bit of an extra, lead time to get into PortalGuard so they can use the single sign-on side of things.
So roughly, do you do you have like a rough idea as to how much time it takes to get all that synced? Just I mean, just for
It,
knowledge purpose.
yeah. Well, let me see here. I don't think it actually gives me a good idea, but since I have it running every hour, I know the process takes less than an hour to run.
Oh, okay.
So, and I know the CCC apply data is coming in pretty much on a similar sort of schedule. So I would say it's not that far behind, after Banner's updated.
Right. Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
What kind of information is linking with that script?
Let me see if I can pull that up here. So here I'm not on the PortalGuard server anymore. I'm on the PowerShell one for all our scripts. So in here I have the PortalGuard folder, and the process for this is a little bit funky because PortalGuard actually provides like this batch import exe. So it's kind of like a combined process here. So this is the linked account batch imports process, and it calls sync PortalGuard relationships. So I actually need to pop into this one instead. So here I do have some hard-coded kind of information. These GUI IDs are kind of hidden behind the scenes inside each of these folders, I believe. It's this value for each of them. So that's where these came from. And then you guys just saw that prefix, so I need that. We're connecting to Banner. And we're going to be generating some CSV files here. And this is where we get some of the Banner data. But this is pretty much what gets used for the CSV files. So we have a username. We have the link GUI ID. So this is that long kind of repository GUI ID value, and then the username. So like, let's say like Omar.Ramos, I want to connect it to the student GUI ID with oramos1 as my student username. And then for the Banner part, it would be Omar.Ramos is linked with that Banner GUI ID, and then my G number. But my G number is really that prefix plus the G number. So it's a pretty simple file. It just has those 3 columns. But from here, this batch import stuff kind of takes over and actually interacts with the PortalGuard database for us. And I guess one other thing to mention there, since this file runs that script, but then it kind of kicks off those executables in the different folders, it kind of doesn't give us a ton of insight back to the screen. So like when I run this script manually, sometimes it has some info, sometimes it doesn't. So it just kind of depends. But actually, I take that back. I think it does show the information as it's running. So I think it's okay. I think what I meant to say is that information isn't included in the email that I see. So I essentially would have to run things manually to get more insight. But that's the only thing. Any more questions on this side?
No.
Okay. I'll switch back over here. So under the bootstrap area, this is just all kinds of configuration, right? All this was done many moons ago when we kind of first started adopting the solution. So this has the tie-in to like the PortalGuard database on SQL Server. We don't have some of these other features. Some of these might be new too that didn't exist before. General directory type stuff. Like all these keys we had to generate like once at the very beginning. This one's important because this is where we see like the email and regroup integrations occur. So here I just have it configured for the SMTP relay server, and I have it configured on port 2526, and that kind of helps keep that traffic in a separate log file for us. This one is the regroup API key, so that allows the text messaging when you're using that for your one-time passcode. Regroup also works for the voice side. And then I think I have Duo in here when we enabled that. We're not making use of these other ones really. Okay, I guess I have the CAPTCHA one enabled. And we're not doing any biometrics. So here's a little bit more manual type stuff. I've added a few, whitelisted and blacklisted entries, but I don't come in here and do this. And I think there might be some automatic lockouts that happen separately. And then this one's pretty important, the license one. They seem to be fairly strict on the licensing. Like, I don't know if it would just, prevent PortalGuard from being used if we ever forgot to renew. But they're definitely pretty strict on this, I feel. So typically as soon as Angie receives the new one, I'll try and, enter it in here. So those are the core kind of things. And then from there, we have those user repositories, which we talked about a little bit, the security policies. So what's kind of neat about this is that, it's based off of these users that I'm specifying here. And they kind of have that other part with the repositories, but the rest of this, we could technically configure differently between staff and students. So like if we wanted to, we could make students, always require two-factor or something, or, on the reverse, make all staff require two-factor. And then we could eliminate some of these options. Like right now we have the SMS option, we have the phone option for one-time passcodes, but maybe in the future we want to take those off and we just want to allow mobile authenticators only. That's an option we could choose to make with all these different configuration choices. And then all these other ones just allow you to configure it even more fine-grained for different services. And then for the unlocking, I have different email addresses configured, different messages configured. We don't have this one enabled, so. I was gonna experiment with this grouped option not that long ago, mainly because they're in Vicky Carr's area. I know with A&R, they kind of have this situation that crops up pretty often, which is that when a new student comes in, well, they have to go through the first login steps before they can even get into WebStar, right? So that tends to pose a little bit of a time challenge, because that adds extra time for each student they have to assist. So for a while, I've been wanting to try and make it where maybe it would be optional for the first couple logins, where they could skip that enrollment step, but it's still been kind of tricky because even with some of this, I don't think it was actually possible. So, but some of these options, like the grouped option, was something that came after I think our last update. So it was something that we could now experiment with. Yeah, there's a lot of settings in here though. Like, I don't memorize them. I just kind of pop in here and try and find where it is that I'm, need to make an adjustment when it comes up. Our password rules are pretty open right now. We did have to set this upper character limit, I think, because of WebStar. I think the GOB TPAC table had a limit of 20 for the password. Otherwise, we would kind of have a higher upper limit here. But you could see we don't have any complexity rules, so it's pretty open. And then the only other check is when somebody resets their password, it does that extra check against the PWN password database, which helps avoid people choosing bad passwords.
So all of this, is it something that you configure once and really don't touch it anymore?
Pretty much, yeah. Like I haven't had to come in here and touch like these at all. Only when I was doing that kind of more recent experiment for like Vicky, I think I created like these testing ones. And so for these, I could like create an override for myself, right? And so, okay, this slightly different configuration applies to my student user account. So I can run some tests there or with these other two students that I kind of added in because I think there was something related there. Maybe they were new. So I was able to test like how they experience it versus how it, like in my case, since I've already set up SSO or two-factor before for my account behaves a little bit differently than a completely new student's. So that's why these ones are in the list. But if I uncheck the policy enabled and hit save, then for sure, like this one wouldn't be applied anymore after I do this step. So this is a good result. We just got it to green and it finished really quick, which is what we want. Every so often, when you hit sync, it takes forever and then you get a failure. And that's usually when folks will start calling and say, hey, PortalGuard seems like it's not working anymore. So whatever happens behind the scenes when it tries to apply that update and it fails, it seems to also end up affecting other stuff. But once you reboot the server, it all comes back. So that's the solution if that ever crops up. The one I'll kind of also mention separately is this program accounts one. So this is where I think Abelardo might remember with the, we added the Study Skills Center one in here. And basically what this helps with is it no longer has that extra requirement for the banner side. And so with that,
this was with the cops, right? The campus security that don't have a G number assigned to them.
Yeah, I think, we got a couple of those in there too. So, and then I think the Student Health Center was another one kind of recently. But it's supposed to apply to everybody under program accounts. The reason why these ones are also on the list is because I think some of these aren't in that folder. So I just added them explicitly to the list. And really all that does is kind of like students, right? Like if a student doesn't have their G number, when they go to log in, they get that prompt saying, hey, the secondary information is not found. That's what these users were getting too. But since they're not real like staff members that are tied to a G number, we put them in this list and that allows them to skip that process because this one doesn't have that requirement. And I think on top of that, I think I don't have like password resets as an option either for these to kind of avoid that ability for people to change a password for those, which we kind of would want to avoid anyway, I feel. So, but yeah, this one's special. And then we don't use this credibility stuff at all. Don't ask me what it does because I never looked into it. And even the PortalGuard support people were like, yeah, most people don't use this. So maybe it comes in more like in a military situation where they have like really strong requirements maybe. So with those basics kind of out of the way, we could switch over to the fun stuff, which is that part on the right with the identity provider.
So quick question.
Yeah.
The PowerShell scripts, do they update the user repositories?
No, they don't. What they do, I wasn't planning on showing this, but I guess it makes sense. So let me log in to the SQL Server side here. I'll probably get a prompt. Let me get ready for that. Oh, I was like, I have my phone on airplane mode so that if I get a call, I don't run into that situation where my headphones switch to something else. So let me see. Okay, hit OK. Approved. Okay. So I'm not an expert on SQL Server, but kind of like the rest of you, since we know how to run queries, we kind of at least have a rough ability to do some query type work in here. But I really don't know how to manage SQL Server at all. So just give it a few moments to load up. Basically, what I'm going to try and show you here is just that this batch import stuff, all this data is going directly into the what's called the P star, or the PortalGuard database here. And let me think. That is all pretty much. I don't think there's a separate table for it. I think it's just all under the registration data, or maybe the profile. We'll see. So one thing that the PortalGuard folks kind of make heavy use of, which is a little bit annoying, is this XML data column. So if, let's say, well, if I click on one of these, hopefully. So these are the details for this particular student. So we have some encrypted security question type answers. So this is for the other file, the verbal auth. So this pulls in some information from Banner, which is the G number, the last four of the SSN, the age, the date of birth, and the city. This is an underutilized feature, but if let's say A&R wasn't using our old password reset tool and they were using just the help desk functionality that PortalGuard provides, they would kind of be doing a verbal authentication of somebody over the phone of that information, and it would verify like that the values match, and then they would maybe proceed with initiating a password reset or something through PortalGuard. So we were talking about the linked accounts, right? So that's this information here. So this student is linked with the G number here. So when these different batch import processes run, when it does the update for the linked account piece, essentially it says, for this username, add this link in. And that's it. And then for staff one, they're going to have two. They're going to have one for the student username, and they're going to have another one for the G number. If I pull up myself, if it lets me here, where uname equal to if I click on mine, you'll see that there's a little bit more, well, actually quite a bit more in here. So you see things like my enrolled email, my enrolled phone number. There is some stuff in here about Duo and the mobile phone kind of mobile authenticator app integration that I've set up. So like all this is in here. I had kind of toyed with the idea of being able to like clear out some of these fields from PowerShell or PHP, but I just never really messed with it because it would have required me to connect to a SQL Server database, which is kind of like in addition to connecting to MySQL or connecting to Oracle. And even though it probably wouldn't have been that difficult, it was just something I just hadn't really bothered to do. But I'm showing this mainly because if I show you guys, let me open a window that has slightly less tabs. So if we go to this help desk URL for PortalGuard, and I think pretty much all of you should be able to log in to it. Let me log in here. So this is where I was talking about the ability to verbally identify a user. So here, if you pulled somebody up, it would have those security type questions. But the other one that's cropped up is pulling up students or staff and sometimes needing to clear a specific user field. And this was happening a lot when we first moved to PortalGuard because students during initial setup would have opted in accidentally into 2FA. So every time they logged in, they were having to do the one-time passcode thing. The other thing that crops up is like, oh, this person changed their phone number. They don't have that old one anymore. So help desk might have to clear out their registered self-enrolled email or self-enrolled phone. But the only problem is that if you want to do all three, you basically have to do next and then come back to the beginning, pull up the user again, come here, pick the next one. So it's a little bit of an annoying process to clear out like multiple fields because you have to go through it several times. And I don't recommend doing the reset process because what that would do is that it would essentially like clear all of this out again. So this process would have to run one more time to get like the G number information back in, for example. So it would just kind of add more delays if you were to use the reset option. But yeah, when you clear out specific fields in that help desk page, it'll really just be coming here to the record and kind of clearing out some of these related fields that are in this XML column. So it's an interesting, I guess, way how they designed it, but it does make it harder to do updates, right? Because like we're more used to, from a database perspective, working with actual column values. So when you have XML in there, there's a slightly different approach you have to take when you're doing updates. So if anybody ever digs into this, that's I guess something to be aware of.
Interesting. And where in PortalGuard is the link to that PStar database?
That was under the Bootstrap. So here under user data and then the SQL tab, this was the configuration for it.
Oh,
and I'm thinking that maybe also in the ODBC, let me just check if it's also set up here. Yeah. So we do set it up here up front as well as the Oracle connections. And then we tie into them here, and then also here. So should we continue with the identity provider stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So on this side, it also has its IDP settings. This is probably the big one is related to like the certificates. So recently we added a SHA-256 certificate in, and that's this guy here. So that was important to support newer third-party systems that we're working with that are like essentially now requiring that as the main thing. It's possible that maybe more of our SAML integrations are going to maybe start requesting that change, but so far it's only been a few of the new ones that have actually asked for it. And really the only one that required it was Tableau. So the other ones, I think it was still more or less optional. So there's not much else in here aside from that. This last one is the one that enabled that new option for staff to create those custom groupings on the PortalGuard jump page. So now you can create, different folders and organize stuff. So this is where that's enabled. One thing to note about these signing certificates, if we wanted to just have I guess I'll mention two things. So within PortalGuard, like whenever you do an upgrade with them, they have a diagnostic function, which is this guy here. And what's cool about this, I guess, little utility that they're providing is that it's a nice way to kind of do a backup essentially of all the important stuff. So if we selected all this, except for maybe the logs, let's say, we don't really need those. If we create the zip file, it typically does it right here on the desktop somewhere. So 2021. So I think it's this file.
Backing up the database, right? That's just the application layer here on the server. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. If it did the database too, that would be awesome, right? But
yeah, that'd be great.
But what's good about this for the support team, let's say, is that it has kind of like these version info. Maybe the Bootstrap has, I don't know if this one actually has what's in this Bootstrap file. It may. This folder is like, we have some customizations on the web side of things. I'll actually mention one important one in a second for that. But the big one here is the policies. So all of these single sign-on bits, these are all copied in, or they're all located in this policies folder. And so the diagnostic file includes that as well, which is useful. Because really you can take these and drop them into like another PortalGuard install. And if it's your own stuff, it'll probably just work. But if it's on somebody else's system, well, maybe they might have to tweak it a little bit to make it work. But at least you're not stuck doing the following, which is like in each of these, you have identity claims and you have to like add them in one by one. So it would at least save all that time, So that's the good thing about this backup. The other part of it, which I'm actually not seeing here, so I guess I should mention it separately, is that the core certificates that are used for our metadata are in this certificates folder. So we kind of have the original one, which is a SHA-1, I guess, certificate. And then we have the newer SHA-256 version. And then I guess I created a separate one for OpenID Connect, but maybe that one wasn't really needed. The other thing I was going to mention was that since this is all kind of like Windows-based technology, they do use Microsoft's IIS web server. And then, so here in the inet pub folder, we have PortalGuard, and then layouts, images, JavaScript, I think. And they have a couple of these different files. Typically, this PG custom one is where the actual customizations are made. And this one was important to mention because down here at the bottom are actually the custom additions that we need for the FA batch type stuff. So like if FA batch 26 is not in this list, right? So if I go to PortalGuard and I type in FA batch 26, it actually assumes that it's a student username, because the pattern that we have is that, you know, staff usernames have a dot in them and student usernames don't typically. But this happens to be a staff or, you know, an imperial.edu type username that doesn't have a dot. So we kind of have to add some exceptions for these. And this is where that occurs. The rest of this is just kind of like the little piece that does that detection and automatically adds in the add imperial.edu and at students.imperial.edu. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that it's in this file. Okay. So I guess from here, we could talk about kind of like the difference between the CAS ones and the SAML ones in terms of the configuration. So probably a good example is like the banner stuff here. So for banner admin pages, we could see that it's a CAS configuration. For CAS things, generally you have this service ID concept. And so rather than an entity ID, like what SAML calls it, for CAS, they call it like a service ID. So this is typically the URL that initiates the single sign-on request. And if a server is strict enough, it wants you to specify these directly in here because, well, probably for two reasons. One is specifying it here in the list actually helps PortalGuard to say, oh, this configuration is related to this server because of this piece tying it together. But on top of that, sometimes you have additional URLs. So here I have this gen SS one also in the list. And that might have been because, yeah, maybe the login was able to start successfully, but maybe it still failed. And usually after reviewing the logs, there is like a second URL also shown. And so that's where maybe sometimes there's more than one in the list. The next part is the claims. The claims are all of the attributes that we have to return. Luckily for banner stuff now, most of it is determined by that banner UDC ID value. And since we have a custom attribute in Active Directory, we can easily grab that directly from Active Directory users, and we could return that. Aside from that, we have these extra ones, but maybe they're not even needed. But they're there. The SSO jump page tab, this is how it's presented when you log into PortalGuard. So this is the label that you see. We do have the option of display images. We just haven't decided to do that. And then there's the URL that users can click on to go log in. The response tab, we don't usually do a lot here, but in some cases like this one, we do check this SAML validate option. So this one's kind of funky because essentially that means that you're using CAS, but like in the response, you're kind of using SAML 1.1. And that's what a lot of the banner stuff was using. So that's why we have that enabled. And I think this artifact binding as well. The authorization tab is just which OUs or users are allowed to see this and I guess use it as well. So that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that last tab, the authorization, that prevents accessing banner using students.imperial.edu. Right.
Actually, it's two things. So under identity claims, because of how we have things configured overall, like on the first kind of configuration editor area we went through, we have things set up so that we explicitly kind of define the staff one here.
Oh, okay.
And so even if we enabled like, well, yeah,
because even if we added students.impro.edu, then that would still block it, right?
Right. And it would mainly block it from the perspective of, since this is the default attribute store, when a student would try to log in, it probably wouldn't make the right associations and do it correctly.
Mm.
And that's why for the separate students one over here, which is exactly the same configuration as the staff one, the identity claims though come from the student side. And then on the authorization, this is where we kind of have those student workers that occasionally, I think we'd work together on those when Vicky had the request or some other area.
Well, how did you get to that one?
So from the identity provider configuration, we have two. Yeah, we have two for that one. And so the students one is the one I opened.
And that's in the authorization tab.
Yeah, the last tab has all the users. So that one's probably an important one, just in case it needs editing.
You're logging in using
to banner,
using the imperial.edu and not the students, right?
Right, because so this might be less of an issue now, right? Because now we're starting to issue more staff accounts to those types of workers, right, working with us.
Right.
So if they get a staff account, then they're going to be covered by the other one automatically.
Right.
Because that one is already tied to just anybody in that IVCOU, which covers employees.
And Omar, I'm guessing we have the same issue with that as we do with Starfish, in that you're not necessarily told when they leave. So those students may or may not necessarily still need access. It's good to know. It's good to know that that's there as well.
Yeah, and I know we have that issue all over the place at times.
Offboarding, especially with student workers and access.
Yeah. So that's definitely one of those areas. I don't know what I saved there, but it thinks I made a change.
Can we see Argus's configuration?
Yeah, sure.
I'm just curious about it.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember which one we're using. Let's see, we'll find out.
According to maps, it's CAS.
It is CAS? Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing I think I note in one of those documents is that even though Argos here is listed under SAML, right? There's nothing here in the configuration editor that really gave me a hint that it was disabled. So that's a little bit of an annoyance, right? But this configuration will probably work if we re-enabled it down the road, just because we already have it somewhat set up, maybe with some minor adjustments like the URL here, perhaps. But this is from our early testing before we kind of ended up choosing to go with CAS instead as our preferred choice. So if I open up this one, we have our service ID is set to just argos.imperial.edu. And usually if you have this set, it'll kind of cover anything under that domain, usually. So essentially you can consider this as like a slash wildcard for anything like under it. The identity claims, staff, and then it looks like we're just returning SAM account name and the groups. And we're making use of the groups because of those other Argos groups that we now have after we started doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The jump page looks like this. So I think Argos was a little bit weird, and that's why we have this in this way. So essentially we kind of like point back to ourselves, but to trigger the SSO for Argos at the same time, and then you're logged in. So that's probably how that one works. And then we do have all, employees with that access along with the Argos account.
So a quick question in general. So there's times where people log in without the at imperial.edu, and there are those where the at imperial.edu is required. Is there something in here that dictates when that occurs, or is that
so you just mean like specific users that you've seen not use it, or what?
I'm trying to remember. I thought Argos was one, and I could be stumbling onto something else. So there's some times where we don't use the at imperial.edu for the username.
Yeah.
And then there's times where we do need to use the at imperial.edu.
Yeah. So so go
ahead. Sorry.
Okay. I was going to say that a lot of that ends up being kind of system specific. So I'll give you a couple examples here. And here. And let me log out of single sign-on. So, for example, like the Argos one, right?
Right.
I'm pretty sure if I use my full email address, it doesn't work.
It does.
Okay, so, and that's going to be because of how Maps is configured for the login. It might be configured where it can allow either or.
So that is a thing associated with Argos then.
Right. And then like here in PortalGuard, right? If I try and use my full email address, it doesn't work. Okay. I keep on saying stuff that isn't true here. So that works too, but it didn't used to. Let me put it that way. Okay. This one for sure is true. So if I put in my full email address, this one doesn't work, right? So kind of depending on like the individual system, they may or may not allow like the full email address, or they'll require just the username. So that tended to be a bit annoying, right? And it is confusing for users. So that kind of leads me back to what I was sharing about this little helper piece, where if you just put in this and you just happen to tab over, it kind of would automatically, add in the email address part for you.
Cool.
And that was just to avoid that confusion, right? So like if we have the type of user that wants to type out their full email address, they could still do that. If you want or if you have the folks that just automatically think about username only, at least we get those people covered too and kind of reduce a little bit of those issues. The only problem with this approach, let's say, is that like us customizing the Argos login page, right? Maybe that's not even an option. Or me customizing this mock form login page, which, is something I could do. But at the same time, I know that that might be an extra customization I have to maintain, right? So, so since most of our logins are now tied into SSO, though, that actually does help, I think, reduce a little bit of that, right? Because at least people have a somewhat consistent experience on this login page and don't have to use the other ones as much anymore.
Okay, thanks.
So we've done kind of like 2 CAS ones. Let me just open up one of the SAML ones just to compare, and I'll bring up open probably 2 different ones here. Let's say the proxy prod one, since that one's pretty important for the state. So that one, they gave us the identifier to their, well, in this case, their entity ID is also their metadata URL. So they gave us this. And then the other important URL is this assertion consumer URL. And actually, if I can hopefully try this on the fly. Okay, yeah, that doesn't work. If I remember correctly, there was a bit more to this URL that had like MIS 031 in there for our campus and some other information. And that's how I get the XML metadata out from their end. But usually that XML metadata includes this assertion consumer URL for them. And that's how like we typically get that information. From here, we have all the different kind of fields that they were requiring. And as you can see, like this one actually has the CCC ID included, which is important because when people log into Canvas, if it detects that their affiliation is a student, which is how it's configured on this other one for students, it's going to require the CCC ID. And if the student doesn't have the CCC ID, that's when it redirects them to the OpenCCC website. And then they're forced to kind of go through that process so that they have one. So all of these are based off of attributes in Active Directory. So this is the user principal name. The given name is their first name. Surname for the last name, display name, email, CCC ID, and all that good stuff. This one is hidden on the SSO jump page because it gets used indirectly by things like Canvas and other services. The response. So if we switch this, let's say, to the SHA-256 certificate because they needed us to, probably here on the response, we would also be changing like the signing algorithm to SHA-256 as well. But it's still SHA-1 right now. And vendors are going to be doing that just because SHA-256 is supposed to be more secure compared to SHA-1 nowadays. In as many cases as we can, we try and set up the single logout side of things as well. And what that helps accomplish is that if you get logged out, let's say, of that service, it would also make sure that you're logged out of PortalGuard and maybe some other systems as well automatically. And then the authorization tab is still about the same. So this is going to allow all staff. And then if we compare it to the students one, pretty much all the same except for some of the names here. But the identity claims are about the same. You still see add imperial.edu here because that's what the state required, even though like the email address is still going to be at students. But the other one here is the affiliation of student. And that's how I think they determine whether or not to require the CCC ID. And then here you see that the attribute store is the student's one as well. And then we're just limiting things to active students. I'm going to just show the Tableau one just because it should be pretty similar, but so we got our identifier, we got our assertion consumer URL, our name, the attributes we're sending back. This one's set to the SHA-256 one because that one was required in this case. And then we have SHA-256 set for these now. And then it's limited to active employee. Well, it shows up for all employees, even though they're only licensed for certain individuals. So. I'm not sure if there are any other ones you want me to kind of dive into, but.
Well, maybe the starfish one, just to show how that one.
Okay.
I have a quick question.
Uh-huh.
It's related to the meta database that you said that I noticed that several views have at the end of the view that it's part of the meta database. You went through all the views, or how that label it's on all the views on MIS process?
Should I make the tater tots with the burgers?
Are we talking about different things though?
That sounds awesome.
Are you talking about Metabase or?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
yeah, I think Metabase is going to be a different topic, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we want to cover that right now because it's not related to anything that's here on the screen, Betsy, that you're talking about.
Oh, okay. No, well, maybe it's another topic, but yeah, maybe we can talk about later on. That's going to be good.
Yeah, but that one would be a good one if you guys do want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into Metabase tomorrow, perhaps, or something.
Is that what you're talking about, Betsy? Is the dashboard Metabase, right?
No, what I'm saying is that the database, the meta database that it's on the end of the views, on my MIS views that I create, I noticed that someone have labeled it that said that it's part of the meta database view.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe we can look at that as part of the Metabase overview.
Got it. Thank you.
So for the starfish one, it's a little bit different compared to the other two we just saw. So the proxy.
I'll interrupt, Omar. I'm going to hit the drop off, and if I do, please continue. So.
Okay, no problem.
Thanks.
This one's a little bit different because we're just using placeholders. So the main reason for this entry is mainly so that we can have a different, card show up on the PortalGuard page with all the links when you log in. But you could see here that the identifiers part, it doesn't have a separate one. So it's just a placeholder. I do put in the same consumer URL that the proxy prod configuration had, but that's probably only because it was required to have something in there. And all this stuff technically isn't really applicable because, again, this is really just a placeholder, and we just have our label for the jump page. And this is the link that folks actually get taken to when they click on the starfish link. So when they click on that link, behind the scenes, it's actually using that proxy prod configuration. And that's what it's really using. So this one's kind of misleading in that way if you don't know that that's how it works. So that's probably a good one for us to go over here in the video to at least mention that. All the rest of this stuff doesn't matter all that much except for the authorization, which just determines who can see this link when they log into PortalGuard. Any questions on the placeholder part, or is everything kind of good?
That's good.
Yep. Is everybody's brains fried now? Well, I know we've been focused more on
maybe
PortalGuard, right? Yeah. So SSO. So we did the overview, kind of just high level, just kind of talking about the history there for single sign-on, and then we kind of popped in here and got into a little bit of the weeds of PortalGuard, but I know it's still a lot too. So
what kind of troubleshooting or support do you give to PortalGuard besides creating new websites and rebooting the server because the thing failed?
So one of those scenarios was the oddball one that I was kind of describing to you and Jeff. And I'll kind of share that with the team here. So yesterday, Renee reached out to me there in the office, and he was saying that he had gotten a ticket of a student that had been trying to log into the IVC Safe app, and that student couldn't log in. So we did kind of like the basic typical investigation, check the password reset tool. Things kind of looked fine there. Kind of came in here to PortalGuard, and I checked the Ready Education configuration, and there's nothing obviously wrong here. And if it was bad for everybody, we'd be hearing about it. So that kind of didn't seem to be the cause of the issue either. But I asked him, well, let me go check over here in the Active Directory. And when I came and pulled up the user, what I ended up seeing was that they had their account tab it looked like this, right? Which isn't typical. Usually this is all filled in. And this corresponds with the user principal name, right? Which is typically always set. So once I saw that that was blank, we just filled it in manually to fix it. Let's say like this. And then we had the user retry. And so that time, rather than her getting an error, she was able to log in successfully. And that was because this user principal name was now filled in. So that was like the tie-in as to what was the problem and what was the solution. It was a bit of a tricky problem to solve because, it was kind of multiple systems to kind of, correlate against there. But that's one example of a troubleshooting situation. And another one that crops up, I want to say semi-often, is usually related to the email field. And what I see there is like, let's say for example, Ruby, right? She's relatively new to our office anyway. And then let's say they had just created her staff account. What I see sometimes occur is that this email address field is not filled in. And so if that's not filled in, then that does cause issues logging into certain systems. And I want to say Canvas would be one of them. And if not Canvas, then a system like Cornerstone, like several of those types of systems would be affected by the email address not being filled in. And you would think it's filled in automatically somehow, but really that field is different than the ones shown like here. So we don't have to apply them. So in Active Directory, right, we have all of these typical fields that we have filled in. Banner UDC ID is a custom one, and the CCC ID is also a custom field. But we have the mail attribute, right? This mail attribute corresponds with the one here. And then the other one that looks like an email, but which isn't exactly an email, is the user principal name, which is the one that we saw here that was blank for that other user. So quite often if somebody does have an issue logging in to a certain system, sometimes filling in this email field is a solution as well.
So Omar, which tab on that AD record contained? So which tab on that AD record contained the blank email?
Yeah, it was the account tab, and this user login area was completely blank.
No, and but one that you said that sometimes the email field doesn't get populated.
Oh,
so
this
it's
one,
on the general tab. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, because like when, let's say Angie or whoever's, working on creating new staff accounts, when you create a new staff account, aside from the name and the email address or the username, right? Like these ones get filled in automatically based off of the username. And then the name gets filled out based off of the name you provide. But the description, telephone number, this email field, and then any info here under the organization tab, which is typically just job title and department, all of those other ones are filled in manually after the fact.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that hopefully covers one potential troubleshooting situation. Once you've set up a single sign-on, though, and like you as a staff member, you as a student are able to sign in successfully, pretty much from then on, though, like everything does work without trouble. So it's really rare to run into trouble after the fact that isn't like a widespread issue, right? Like if it's not working for like 5 people within a short span of time, then more than likely, it's not working for anybody. And that's where like the reboot is probably the solution, let's say. But if you have these more like oddball user specific type issues, then quite often it's going to be AD related. And the two that I've found have been like the emails missing. And then in this more recent case, that user principal name was missing, which I'm still kind of scratching my head over a little bit because that should never happen. So I'm not even sure how it happened, but hopefully that's, it doesn't seem to be a widespread issue. So thankfully.
So for the rest of the group, this is a lot to take in. We understand.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it took me months just to understand like those differences that I shared about the protocols and the actual products. Like that by itself, if like you take away nothing from what we ended up chatting about here, but just kind of understanding that we do have different single sign-on protocols, and then a bunch of different products that potentially implement them, and just kind of understanding that there's a difference between those two things, that would be a good takeaway in my book. So
right. But it's great to get this introduction or this overview so that at least we somewhat kind of know how things work. So yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
thank you very much. Thank you.